that for all of us, we can relate to having had from time to time a bad day. Maybe for some of us it was as recent as this past Wednesday morning when you woke up and saw more snow, and this time it was wet, and thought, really? Really more snow, and now with water and everything, and thought, oh my goodness, is this enough? And you know that when you have one of those bad days, that once you find yourself in that place, the littlest of things can set you off. And from people on the outside, they may see you kind of go off on something so insignificant and kind of ask to themselves, what's wrong with them? Why are they in such a foul mood? Well, this morning we come to this passage in the Bible. And if you've been with us, we've been kind of going through the book of Mark, looking at various events of Jesus' life to see what they teach us, to come to a better place and a better understanding of the significance and the impact that he's had in this world and he continues to have on those who desire to follow him. And when you read that passage, it seems in some ways a little bit out of context. I mean, we talk so often about the patience and the understanding, and a couple weeks ago, just the compassion of Jesus, and it seems as if he completely goes off. I mean, he loses it on a tree. I'm sure anyone ever had that experience where you just kind of go off on something that's done nothing wrong to you, but you just seem to want to yell at it anyways. And then he goes into the temple, and to put it politely, he kind of rearranges the furniture a little bit. And if you're watching this and you're reading this, you almost want to think, what's going on with Jesus? Like, what? Is he having a bad day? I mean, maybe Mark is just recording this to make us feel better about ourselves. That, you know what, if the Messiah, if God himself can have a bad day, then maybe we're allowed to have one from time to time. But this morning, as we kind of look at this passage, and I think it's important to understand kind of the sequence of events, because so often the events of what happens before Jesus does something significant really helps highlight the truth he's trying to teach. We want to kind of land in a place where we come to a better understanding of what I believe is happening here, but then always then ask the question of, okay, well, what does this mean in my life? What does this mean for us as we kind of leave this place? So the simple sequence of events is essentially Jesus comes into Jerusalem. It's late. He kind of goes into the temple and he's aware of what is happening. He then decides to kind of go back outside the outskirts of Jerusalem into Bethany. The next morning he gets up with his 12 disciples, goes back towards the temple, and on the way he sees a fig tree and leaves, and it has this wonderful appearance, and he's hungry, and he wants to eat something. He wants to eat some of the fruit, and shows up and realizes there's no fruit. But Mark says, it's not the season for fruit. So Jesus gets annoyed at this tree, and then he goes into the temple and just completely goes off. Begins overturning tables, kicking the buyers and the sellers out, refusing to allow anyone to carry any merchandise through the temple. And so we want to ask the question, what is happening? Why did Mark include this? I mean, it doesn't necessarily put Jesus in the greatest of light. I think to better understand, we have to first of all understand a little bit about the temple and a little bit about the context in which all of this was taking place. The temple was given by God to his people as the very presence of God in their midst. The temple was very important for the nation of Israel, the Jewish people. All the way back in Genesis 12, God creates a community of people and essentially says, this is going to be the deal. This is my plan. I am going to be blessing you in order for you to be a blessing. I want people to see a different way of living life with me. I want a relationship. So God establishes rules, regulations, traditions, gives them things such as the temple as a means and a boundary to understand what this relationship is going to look like. So the temple was at the core of their faith. It was a place where they would go for worship and for sacrifice and for prayer. Now, the temple was divided up into different categories, and depending upon who you were, you could enter into different sections of the temple. But the very first section, the section that Jesus has actually walked into and goes off on, is the very first section, and that is what is called the court of the Gentiles. So basically, if you were a non-Jew, you could go into this part, and only this part, in order to worship and to pray. So at the core of a Jew and of their belief, the temple was crucial. Now we understand context that this is actually the final week of Jesus' life before his death. This is typically what we would kind of look at in terms of Palm Sunday, and we may be thinking, Easter's not next Sunday, so you haven't missed anything. But just to sort of understand a little bit, the majority of the teachings and the material of what we have in the Gospels come in Jesus' final week. Over 40% of the Gospel of Mark alone is given to Jesus' final week. So this was a busy time for Jerusalem. It was celebrating the festival of Passover. So thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people would be entering into Jerusalem in order to celebrate Passover, in order to go to the temple. It's estimated by some historians that on this particular week alone, 250,000 lambs would be bought for sacrifice in this 1 week. So here's the scene. It's busy, lots of livestock. People are buying, people are selling, people are exchanging money. It would have been overwhelming. And this is exactly where the Gentiles are supposed to be able to come in order to pray. Not the most quiet of places, not a place where great meditation could take on. I was thinking, what would be kind of a modern day equivalent of this? And I think a modern day equivalent would be like trying to go and find a quiet place to pray in the checkout line of Walmart on Boxing Day. Right? Because I don't know, I think about the temple, I think, I don't know what this is going to look like. But that would be kind of the modern equivalent. So Jesus sees this and loses his mind. And as he's doing it, he says, listen, it's written, don't you people remember, my house, this temple, is to be a house of prayer for all people. But you have made it into a den of robbers. So what's going on? Is Jesus simply having a bad day? Is Jesus simply annoyed because the temple, the house of God, has become too commercial? That if they just kind of scale back their activities a little bit, if they maybe put the money changers and the merchants outside the temple and just kind of clean things up and made it a little bit more civilized, then Jesus would be okay? You see, that's often kind of one direction we want to take. But I think there's something much more significant going on. And the reason I say that is because of what occurs before Jesus goes off in the temple. We're told that Jesus arrives the night before, and he goes into the temple, and he sees what is happening, but doesn't do anything. And then he leaves and goes away. And the next day, on the way to the temple again, he sees this fig tree with leaves, and he's hungry, and he's hoping to get something to eat. So it has the appearance of health. But then when he actually gets to the fig tree, he notices there's no actual fruit. And Jesus curses the fig tree and says, may there be no fruit from you again. And you're kind of left thinking, what was that all about? And then Jesus goes into the temple and begins to overturn tables. And so what's going on? Slight confession here this morning. For anyone who knows me knows that I am not a gardener. I have no green thumbs at all. So what I share with you about fig trees is clearly stuff that I have read and I have found in other places. When it comes to gardening, for me, there are really three categories. There are trees, there are bushes, and there are flowers. So if you want to talk to me about gardening, talk to me in one of those three categories. You may say, well, what about grass? Well, if you looked at my grass and saw the amount of dandelions in my grass, that's a flower. Grass is a flower. You take away the dandelions, I have no grass. And yes, I know a dandelion is not a flower, it is a weed, but it's the best flower that I can grow. So, trees, bushes, flowers. So, a fig tree in the ancient Middle East would bear two types of fruit. Anyone want to guess what one type of fruit is? A fig. There we go. Just checking to make sure you're still with me. Just wanted to see. If someone said cherries, I would have got them some coffee. But there was a second fruit that was the pre-fig fruit. And typically, before the figs would appear, the tree would have leaves appear. And then there'd be these nodules which would bear this pre-fig fruit. And they were very tasty, and they were very abundant, but they were quite small. So from a distance, you couldn't always see if it was bearing fruit. Now, to the untrained eye, like me, if you walked up to this fig tree and you saw leaves, you would say, wow, this is a healthy tree. I can't wait for the figs to appear. But to the trained eye, to someone who has more than 3 categories when it comes to gardening, you would understand that actually something wasn't right with this tree. That even though from a distance it had the appearance of health, that if it had leaves but no pre-fig fruit, that it was actually diseased. There was actually decay going on inside. That there was actually going to be no more figs appear because the tree was dying. It had the appearance of health, but there was absolutely no fruit that was coming. And it's immediately after this event, after Jesus curses this tree, that he then goes in to the temple. One of the things that you may have already picked up on is that so often Jesus teaches through imagery. That Jesus so often finds an object that might have been present on that one particular day and uses it as an opportunity to teach and to highlight an even greater truth. I mean, read through the Gospels and Jesus is constantly doing it. He's always talking about this object or about this farmer or about this story or about this story. He's always wanting to grab something concrete to truly highlight something even more significant that he wants to teach. And what I believe Jesus is doing in this event is using this fig tree, this seemingly innocent yet dying fig tree, as an illustration of the reality of what is happening to the people of Israel. The tree is going to represent what Jesus is going to do in the temple. As I said earlier, Israel was established by God. It was a community created by God in order to display God's love for his people. That as God blessed them, they would then be a blessing. That what God wanted above everything else was a relationship. But we all know that in any relationship, there always needs to be an understanding. I mean, you see this primarily with parents and children. Right? You have rules, you have understandings, you have traditions, you have expectations. And as children are younger, you have to kind of roll it out. And you roll it out. But you want them to grow out of it. So when a child is very young, you want to make sure that they are still eating their vegetables. Right? That is an important thing to do as a parent. That is a rule. That is a tradition. That is an expectation. However, if your grown son or daughter calls you up when you're 32 and says, hey, Mom, do I still got to eat my lima beans? You're going to be kind of disappointed because you're thinking, really? Have you not learned anything? There's certain things that I don't need to tell you what to do on every occasion. And I think in many ways, what we see Jesus so often railing against is this very reality. The fact that God had established rules and regulations and traditions in order to begin a relationship. But the people of God were so caught up in the rules and the traditions and being busybodies that they were actually addicted to the very rules and religion and lost the relationship completely. You see, on the outside, the religious people seemed very healthy. They seemed to live very moral lives. They had a very busy temple. I mean, business was booming. The temple was growing. They had the appearance of health. Yet because they were so caught up in simply following the rules and the regulations and the traditions, they had lost God completely. They had lost relationship. So what does Jesus do? He comes in not simply to clean up the temple, not simply to reform the temple, but to say the temple is no more. It served its purpose in the past There was good fruit that came out of the temple in the past. But the temple, which was once a place that connected people to God, was now actually a barrier to God. So Jesus walked in and completely shut it down. You see, what can happen when we get addicted to things like rituals and traditions and rules is we focus more on appearance and less on character. And character is what comes from within. Character is really the fruit and the reality of who we are. So we can put on a great appearance. We can make it seem like we have it all together. But just like that fig tree, we could be dying inside. And Jesus was again reorienting his followers to an understanding that what I want above everything else is not simply just a shiny appearance, but a character that clearly longs to live life with me. You see, the religious folks were very busy doing other things, but they were losing that which was most important. And we see it time and time again in the teachings of the New Testament is this imagery of fruit, of bearing fruit. We don't have time to go there this morning, but I'm just going to give you references if you want to look it up later. John 15 is where Jesus actually speaks about if you want to bear fruit, then abide in me. Live life with me and you will bear fruit. Paul in his letter to the Galatians were a bunch of people wanting to follow Jesus, but they were starting to slide back into legalism, back into following rules and rituals. And Paul says to them, listen, the mark of the Spirit of God living in you is the fruit of the Spirit. Things like love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and self-control. Those are the fruit. That is the reality of life with God. But the people were missing the point, which is why Jesus made that comment, my house is to be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of robbers. I believe what Jesus was highlighting in this comment is not the fact that simply they were ripping people off in the temple, but something much more significant. Where does a robber go to find security, to find safety? To their haunt, to their den, to the place where they feel I am comfortable, I am safe, I am secure. What Jesus is saying is you have found security in the temple. You think that it doesn't matter how you live or what you do or what you think or how you treat others, that as long as you have a busy temple, as long as you show up to temple, as long as you sacrifice in the temple, then everything is going to be okay. Security is not found in appearance. It's found in a relationship. You see, to God, although they seem to have it all together, they were nothing more than fugitives. So where do we land? What does this mean for us here today when we come to this place of understanding that what Jesus desires is a relationship, and a relationship is found not simply in the appearance that we have, but in the character that we are displaying? It begins to make more sense that what Jesus desires is that ultimately we become more like him. We begin to display the traits and the realities of who he was in our lives as well. You see, the trap we can fall into as followers of Jesus, as a church, is we talk more about appearance of, well, how will this appear? Or how will this look? Or what will other people think of me? And worry more about going deep in our relationship with God. I mean, it's interesting, they're doing more and more studies on this, and one of the things they're realizing is just simply becoming busier in the church is not necessarily a determining factor for a growing faith. So where do we land? Many places we could kind of focus on, but one thing that I have really felt being revealed to me this past week in terms of this passage was this aspect of busyness.
right? One of the great ways that we may find security in our faith is in how busy we may be in terms of doing things for God. We almost wear it as a badge of honor. And I think too often, even pastors will use this and say, I'm too busy. I'm just so busy. And people will come up to you and say, you must be so busy. And you think, yeah, I'm very busy. And we begin to find security in the busyness that we are apparently doing for God. We have the appearance, but we have no health. And this aspect of busyness is a key theme for Jesus. He doesn't only kind of bring it on when he's in conversation with the religious people, but there's that great interaction with, you may be familiar with the story of Mary and Martha. Jesus shows up to spend some time with friends, and Mary just basically hangs out with Jesus. And Martha is not very happy about this. She's off doing things and preparing things and cleaning up things, and finally she comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, tell Mary to help me out. Like, what's the deal here? And Jesus says, Martha, just come and spend some time with me. You seem too busy. Let's just spend some time together. Or in Revelation 2, when Jesus is speaking to a group of Christians in Ephesus, and Jesus says, I know your deeds. I know you are doing so many amazing things, but guess what? You've lost your first love. You've become so busy serving me that you've actually lost me in the midst. So what does this mean? I think we kind of unpack it two ways. First, as a church, and second, as individuals. I think as a church, we need to be very aware that our purpose in life is not to make your lives busier, right? That one of the ways we do not gauge success as a church is by how many programs we run, how many things we are doing, but rather begin to ask the question, are we equipping you, are we encouraging you to live out your faith in the midst of everything that you do? So that a sign of church growth or spiritual health is not just a checklist as to how many programs I am involved at in our church. It makes us begin to kind of rethink some of the things we are doing. So for example, small groups. Small groups is not another program to become involved in, but rather it's an opportunity to deepen this relationship with God while you do it with other people. If you haven't picked up an annual report, there's opportunities for us to see different ways in which we are involved with different people. And the key is in relationships. One of the ways in which we look at community outreach is we haven't established any big programs as of yet. And some people may be wondering, when's the program going to be rolled out? When's the program going to come? But I really feel that as a church, what we want to do is equip you and encourage you to live out your faith day to day. Because God has placed you where he needs you to be. And what we do here is we gather to celebrate at various places and at various times so that we can scatter. And I'm keenly aware that the busier we make your lives, the more unhelpful it can be for spiritual growth. So we want to be very thoughtful about this, very wise in the direction that we go. The second thing is when it starts to look into our own lives. And this is when it gets a little more personal. A little more personal as to what is it that I am striving for in life? Am I looking simply for this appearance, or am I actually wanting to develop this aspect of character? So one of the disciplines, or one of the things I've been doing, is simply asking myself this question: how often am I saying I'm too busy? If someone asks me how I'm doing, do I say, I'm real busy? If someone asks me to do something for them, do I simply say, I can't do that? I'm too busy. And if I catch myself saying that or thinking that, what I then want to ask myself is, why is my life so busy? And what is my busyness preventing me from doing? Now, by no means are we saying, you know what, we just suddenly stop doing everything and just sit back and relax and do nothing. There's nuance to this. But we begin to ask ourselves the question, what is our busyness preventing us from truly doing? Because if we want to become more like Jesus, One of the things about Jesus' ministry was he was interrupted all the time. Jesus, I would argue, was probably the most interrupted individual who ever walked the face of this earth. And if you go back to that list of fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, starting in 22, read through it. There's 9 of them. And identify how many of those are linked to interruptions. Just give you a few. If I want to become more patient, if I want to become more kind, more gentle, more self-controlled, I'm thinking interruptions are a pretty good way to help me get there. But so often we think, you know what, I want to be more patient, I want to be more patient, and then interruptions start to come and think, I just want to be more patient. And we start to miss them. What interruptions, I believe, allow us to do is create margin in the midst of life. It begins to allow for spontaneity, for opportunities, for ministry that otherwise, unprogrammed, wouldn't have happened. I'm just going to close with these 2 stories. Both happened on Wednesday, so back to the wet snow. Dropped Canaan off at his kids' program, his daycare on Wednesday, and I'm driving down Grand River Street. And, the roads had just been plowed, and when the plow goes by your driveway, just the mess that leaves. And Wednesday was even more of a mess, and it's wet, and it's slushy, and I'm driving down, and I'm passing this one particular house, and their driveway had just been filled in. And it's an older couple. And I see them going out to begin to shovel. And I think, oh, that's awful. I should go help them. And I'm like, hey, what do you know? I have a shovel in the back of my van. Why do I have a shovel in the back of my van? And I keep driving, and I see it. I'm kind of stopped at a light a little bit, and I keep driving. I should really stop and help them. But guess what came to mind? I'm too busy. I got stuff to do. I got places to be. I got to go to the church. I got to prepare a message about not being too busy for Sunday morning. Yeah, the irony's pretty thick, right? So, loop around, come back, help them shovel out their driveway. Took me maybe 10 minutes. Very grateful. Just very thankful. Had a little conversation with them, nothing much. But I thought, how often am I missing these opportunities, these interruptions to actually provide ministry? Probably one of the most well-known teachings of Jesus is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And there's many things we can teach on, but basically, if you haven't heard the story before, a guy's walking down the road, he gets robbed, beaten up, thrown into a ditch, left for dead, and 2 people, a priest and a Levite, 2 incredibly busy individuals, pass him by. Why? Well, for a couple of reasons, but I'm thinking one of them is they were busy people. They had things to do for God. Guy in the ditch. Final story. Back to Wednesday. On Thursday morning, one of the other staff here at the church came to talk to me. Not going to mention their name because they wanted to remain anonymous, so I'm going to do a brief survey after the service as to which staff member you think it was. No, I won't do that. They came up and talked to me, and they said, interesting thing happened to me yesterday. I was out shoveling snow, and a neighbor, so someone kind of within eyesight, was shoveling out their driveway as well. And you could see they were kind of struggling and trying to get their car out. You know when you don't really shovel it out, you just try to do enough to get your car out and you can't actually get it out, so you get annoyed, you have to shovel a little bit more. So this staff member walked over and said, listen, can I help you out? And the neighbor says, yeah, that would be great. I got to get to work and I got to sort this out. And the staff member said, well, let me help you. You go, I'll shovel out the rest of it, you'll be fine. And the neighbor said, well, don't you have to go to work? And they said, yeah, but that's okay. Just you go and I'll sort it out. So the day goes by. The neighbor shows up and comes over to the person and says, so thank you so much for helping me out. Did you get in real big trouble for being late for work? And the person says, no, I didn't get in trouble at all. You mean your boss wasn't wasn't angry? He said, no, he wasn't upset at all. The person says, well, where do you work? He says, I actually work at the church, the Presbyterian church in town. And you mean they weren't upset that you weren't there right on time? I don't know if I have the reputation of a taskmaster in town, but if I do, let me know. And the person says, you know what? They probably would have been more upset if I left you here just to go to work. And a conversation ensued. And the neighbor began to say, you know, I used to go to church. I don't go anymore. Because the church I went to seemed to focus more on rules and less on people. But it sounds like maybe your church is different. And out of that, a conversation began to develop. And more conversation developed. I begin to wonder, how many ministry opportunities do we miss because we are too busy? Because we fail to recognize the interruptions that God brings into our life. This is where the fun part starts, is as it's nuanced in all of our lives. But I think it begins by simply being aware of this trap of busyness, this trap of appearance, this trap of thinking that spiritual health is based upon our performance and based upon the things we do, as opposed to the person that we are becoming. There's no rule book for this, per se. But it's quietening our lives enough to allow Jesus the permission and the opportunity for us to hear him when he wants to interrupt our lives. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus, is to live life as he lived, to focus on the relationship. And one of the great ways that we deepen our relationship with God is in showing love and service to others. I invite you to please stand as we sing together.